The room was filled with diplomats, advisors, and cameras, but the tension cut through it all like a blade. The U.S. Capitol had never seen a guest quite like Ibrahim Traoré, calm, unreadable, and unapologetically firm. He was invited to a closed foreign policy forum, supposedly to exchange perspectives, but the real agenda was something else entirely: containment. Adam Schiff leaned forward from his seat across the polished table, his tie too perfect, his grin too measured. "You know," he began, the room going quiet, "you can parade around this town, shake hands, talk big. But let's not pretend. You're not elected. You're just a coup leader." The words dropped like acid. A few chuckles flickered nervously among the American delegates. Schiff's smile widened as if he had delivered a checkmate. Traoré didn't flinch. He adjusted his posture slightly, his gaze still locked on Schiff. Then he spoke, low, even, and laced with steel. "I may not have arrived through your ballot boxes, Congressman," he said, "but I walk with something you lost long ago, the will of my people." Silence. Traoré continued, his voice rising just enough, "They called me in the dark. Not from polling booths, but from the soil. From the villages your policies forgot. From the mothers who buried sons so that puppets could stay in power." Schiff raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain control, but the room was shifting. Even aides behind him sat straighter. "I'm not here for validation," Traoré said, "I'm here to make sure you never get to call theft aid again." Outside the chamber, headlines were already being written. Inside, Schiff sat quieter now, trying to regain his footing. He hadn't expected fire. He thought he saw just a soldier. But Traoré had come as something more. A storm. Schiff leaned back slightly, his smirk fading as if the gravity of Traoré's words pulled it off his face. He opened his mouth to speak but found no rehearsed line strong enough to follow that blow. One of his aides leaned in, whispering something, but Schiff waved him off, eyes locked on the man across the table who had just rewritten the dynamic in the room. Traoré sat still, calm as ever, but there was a quiet blaze behind his eyes. He wasn't finished. "You call it a coup," Traoré said, this time addressing the full table. "But in my country, they call it a correction. A refusal to die quietly while your partners drained our future." A heavy pause followed. "Funny," he added, "how democracy matters most when it serves your interests. But when a nation rises without your permission, suddenly it's illegal." Schiff tried to recover. "We're here to support global order," he said, tone clipped. "Not order." Traoré cut in, his tone sharpened. "The same order that left us with broken schools, looted mines, and foreign bases we never asked for?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the American side of the table. Cameras zoomed tighter. "You lecture about law," Traoré continued, "yet history shows your law bends to your profit. The only thing I overturned was the silence, the lie that we needed you to survive." Outside, the press gallery was already in motion. Twitter feeds were igniting. Hashtags began trending, #Traoré Unfiltered and #Core Courage. Back inside, Schiff's fingers tapped nervously on the table. His plan had been simple: expose Traoré, belittle him, dismiss him. Instead, he had given him a global microphone. And Traoré? He had only just begun to use it. The moderator cleared his throat, trying to steer the conversation back to constructive dialogue, but the damage was done. The air had changed. Even the diplomats who came in skeptical of Traoré now leaned in, intrigued. This wasn't the face of chaos they had expected. It was precision. It was poise. It was power. Adam Schiff, still recovering from the blow to his narrative, tried to reposition. "If we're going to speak plainly," he said, voice tighter now, "let's acknowledge the cost of instability. Burkina Faso's actions have raised concerns. The withdrawal from Western alliances, the expulsion of advisors." Advisors? Traoré said, leaning forward for the first time. You mean handlers? A stunned silence. Traoré's voice dropped, slow and deliberate. Let's be honest. You didn't send aid. You sent leverage. You didn't send advisors. You sent surveillance. Somewhere across the table, a French delegate coughed awkwardly. You came with contracts that buried us in interest, Traoré continued. Military aid that built bases, not peace. And when we pushed back, you painted us as savages. Coup plotters. Threats to order. He paused, letting the words settle. But here's what you can't understand, he added. My people don't want your order. They want their own. Schiff clenched his jaw, clearly rattled. You speak as if you represent all of Africa. Traoré smiled, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I represent the part of Africa that remembers. That remembers who took what. That remembers who watched as we bled and then sold us bandages. A gasp was heard in the back. And then Traoré delivered the line that would echo across news cycles for days. You mistake silence for submission. But we were not sleeping. We were loading. The room froze. In that moment, Traoré wasn't just speaking to Schiff. He was speaking to history. And history, it seemed, was listening. Back in Washington, the footage exploded. Clips of Traoré's takedown aired non-stop across networks. Some anchors framed it as dangerous rhetoric. Others called it a rare moment of brutal honesty on the global stage. But viewers? They watched in silence. Then in awe. Even those who had never heard of Burkina Faso now knew its president's voice. Adam Schiff, meanwhile, was in damage control mode. His staff scrambled to rewrite press statements, downplay the exchange, and push articles questioning Traoré's legitimacy. But it wasn't working. The internet had crowned a new voice, one that didn't ask to be heard, but demanded it. In the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, leaders replayed the video in private chambers. He said what we all feel, murmured one delegate from Kenya. He said what we're too afraid to say, replied another from Senegal. Back at the UN, Schiff made one last attempt to recover face. During a panel discussion on global partnerships, he addressed Traoré directly across the aisle. We understand your frustrations, he said, measured. But rage isn't a strategy. Building nations requires patience. Partnership. Traoré didn't blink. You confuse rage with memory, he replied. We remember because we must. Because forgetting has cost us too much. Then he leaned back and added with a subtle nod, and partnerships? They must begin with respect. Not lectures. A wave of murmurs filled the room. Traoré had taken the insult Schiff tossed and turned it into fuel. Every word he spoke didn't just defend his actions, it dismantled a narrative decades in the making. For years, men like Schiff had shaped Africa's image abroad. But now, that image was talking back. And it had a name. That evening, in a dimly lit side hall of the UN building, a few Western diplomats gathered for an off-record conversation. Traoré's name dominated the whispers. Not out of fear, but out of confusion. Frustration. Even admiration, though few would admit it aloud. He's rewriting the rules, said a senior EU official. And we're still speaking the language of control. Meanwhile, Traoré sat alone in a modest room upstairs, reviewing notes from his team. A quiet moment. But not a restful one. He had just defied a system that rarely forgives defiance. Marie, his political strategist and lifelong ally, entered without knocking. You saw what Schiff's aides are pushing to the media, she asked, placing a folder on the table. He opened it. Headlines, populist strongman or clever manipulator? Burkina Faso leader uses history as a shield, Traoré, the new face of global instability? Traoré barely glanced at them. They can question my method, he said calmly. But they won't silence my message. Marie studied him. You understand you've become more than a leader, right? You're a symbol now. And symbols, they're either worshipped or destroyed. Traoré's eyes didn't move. Then we protect what we've become. Not with guns, but with truth. Downstairs, Schiff was preparing for a CNN interview. His aides rehearsed lines with him, urged him to appear firm, rational, presidential. But Schiff couldn't shake the image of that moment, when Traoré said, "We were loading." It haunted him. Not because of its threat. But because it felt inevitable. Traoré wasn't simply angry. He was prepared. He wasn't out for chaos. He was building a blueprint. And for the first time in years, Adam Schiff didn't feel like the one holding the pen. The next morning, the world had chosen its sides. Social media platforms were ablaze. One clip, just 6 words, had gone viral: "I'm my people's hero." It was edited over footage of farmers harvesting rice, children in schools built from reclaimed aid funds, and women leading cooperatives across West Africa. The caption underneath read, "He didn't ask for applause. He earned it." Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Adam Schiff stood before a podium, trying to reframe the narrative. "We support African progress," he declared. "But progress must be rooted in democratic legitimacy, in cooperation, not provocation." The words fell flat. One reporter asked bluntly, "Isn't it true your comment came across as dismissive? You implied President Traoré rose to power illegitimately." Schiff hesitated. "I merely reminded him of the importance of democratic values." Another voice followed, "And who reminded you of his people's voice?" Schiff's jaw clenched. The press conference ended sooner than planned. Across the Atlantic, Traoré was visiting a village where irrigation systems had just been installed. He wasn't dressed in a suit. No security theater. Just a man among his citizens, walking barefoot through wet soil, sleeves rolled up. A journalist approached. "Mr. President, do you regret confronting Adam Schiff so directly?" Traoré looked at the rice stalks bending under morning sun. "Regret? No. Men like him are used to speaking without being answered. I only reminded him that Africa doesn't whisper anymore." The journalist nodded, but hesitated. "And what if the West retaliates? With sanctions, pressure, media campaigns?" Traoré turned slowly. "Then we grow stronger. Because now we know, what they fear isn't rebellion, it's independence." The camera zoomed in. His face was calm, unshaken. For every insult thrown, he had built a foundation. For every smirk, he had lifted another voice. Adam Schiff had tried to reduce him to a label. But Ibrahim Traoré was already becoming a legacy. That night, a televised panel aired on BBC World. The topic: Global South Rising. Are we witnessing a shift in power? On one side sat American political strategist Helen Strauss and French economist Marc Delatour. On the other, a Ghanaian activist, a Nigerian policy scholar, and a former UN development chair. Traoré's name surfaced within minutes. Helen scoffed. "Let's not glorify rhetoric. Traoré speaks well, but one man doesn't undo centuries of economic structure. It's romanticism, not reform." The Ghanaian activist smiled. "Maybe. But sometimes romanticism is the first crack in the wall." Mark added, "You must admit, comparing himself to a hero is self-aggrandizing. It lacks humility." The Nigerian scholar leaned forward. "Is it self-aggrandizing, or is it necessary? We've had generations of silence. Maybe the West forgets how long we've been told to wait. To listen. To obey. Now someone says, 'We're done waiting,' and suddenly it's a threat?" The panel grew quiet. Meanwhile, Schiff was on a late call with senior State Department officials. He was demanding strategic responses, economic levers, diplomatic pressure points. But the answers were evasive. Africa wasn't responding the way it used to. Embassies were receiving coordinated messages, "We stand with Traoré." His narrative, carefully crafted over decades, was slipping. And the man who caused it had never once entered the room to ask permission. In Ouagadougou, Traoré sat with his advisory team reviewing a letter. It was from a European think tank, requesting an interview. Not to critique, but to understand. He folded it neatly. "This is how it begins," he said. "Not with cheers. Not with flags. But with confusion, then curiosity." Marie looked up. "And then?" He smiled faintly. "And then they listen." In Washington, Schiff was unraveling. What was meant to be a clever jab, a casual swipe at a foreign leader, had become a global misstep. His office was flooded with emails. Some were from allies asking what had possessed him to mock a sitting head of state. Others, more biting, came from African American activists who now viewed Traoré as a cultural mirror, defiant, unyielding, and proud. The irony was bitter. Schiff, once seen as the voice of reason against tyranny, was now the symbol of tone-deaf arrogance. Meanwhile, in Dakar, a regional leadership summit was underway. Traoré stood before a circle of presidents and ministers. No red carpets. No choreographed smiles. Just raw dialogue. One official from Senegal leaned in. "Traoré, are you aware the Americans are quietly lobbying the IMF to delay funding to nations aligned with your rice initiative?" "I'm aware," he replied. "That's why we're not asking anymore." He pointed to a map showing irrigation corridors stretching across 5 countries. "We're not building for loans. We're building for legacy." The room nodded in silence. A South African minister added, "You turned an insult into a movement." Traoré responded, he thought, just a soldier was an insult. But soldiers build more than walls. They carry the people when no one else does. That night, a photo trended across social media. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a protest. It was Traoré sitting on the edge of a well, listening to a teenage girl describe her dream of becoming an engineer. The caption read, "She doesn't need charity. She needs soil, seeds, and someone who listens." In a distant office, Adam Schiff stared at the image on his screen. No propaganda. No anger. Just quiet power. His phone buzzed. A colleague sent him a single line. "You didn't just underestimate him. You woke him up." Back in the US, the media tide had shifted. What started as a brief political spat had turned into a reckoning. Late-night hosts replayed the clip of Schiff's smirk and Traoré's response, placing them side by side. The comparison was brutal. One man looked smug and rehearsed, the other resolute and raw. Cable news pundits were split. Some doubled down, calling Traoré dangerous populism. Others admitted what was becoming harder to deny: the man was shaping the global narrative without lifting a finger toward war. A trending article from The Atlantic read, "Traoré is not a threat, he's a mirror." In it, the author argued that the discomfort leaders like Schiff felt had less to do with policy and more to do with the loss of assumed superiority. Traoré wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was building his own. Meanwhile, Schiff's team scrambled to control damage. They pitched a documentary to recenter the conversation, a polished special on democracy, aid, and American leadership in Africa. But when the production team reached out to Traoré's office for a comment, they received a 2-word reply. "We're busy." In Burkina Faso, Traoré addressed a gathering of local university students. One asked, "Mr. President, how do we respond to those who say we're naive for going against old powers?" He paused, then answered softly, "Naive is believing someone else will fix your future. Brave is building it, knowing they'll try to stop you." The crowd erupted, not with chaos, but with fire in their eyes. And as he left the hall, one professor whispered, "He doesn't speak like a president." Another replied, "No. He speaks like a storm coming." Weeks later, Adam Schiff appeared on a televised panel. The topic: Rising Global Voices. When Traoré's name came up, Schiff's smile faltered for a moment, the kind of pause that reveals more than words ever could. "He's passionate," Schiff said, trying to remain composed. "But passion without partnership doesn't build lasting peace." The moderator raised an eyebrow. "Is it partnership, or permission you're upset he no longer asks for?" The room fell quiet. Across the Atlantic, Traoré stood at a modest podium in Ouagadougou. No fanfare. No teleprompter. Just hundreds of young farmers, engineers, and students, the very generation he had sworn to uplift. "I was told," he began, "that I was only a soldier. That I lacked the polish, the diplomacy, the pedigree." He looked up, eyes steady. "But what they didn't see was the battlefield I came from. Not of guns, of hunger. Not of war, of forgotten names and stolen futures." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Today, we feed our neighbors. We build our own systems. And we do it not for applause, but because the ground beneath us is finally ours." A wave of cheers rippled through the crowd. Then, quietly, he added, "They laughed at our roots. Now they fear our branches." Later that night, a reporter asked if he had a message for the U.S. Traoré smiled faintly. "Tell them we're not angry," he said. "We're awake." And as the camera pulled back, capturing Traoré walking alone through the dusklit fields, a caption faded in across the screen. "History remembers those who build, not those who smirk." And so, when Adam Schiff smirked, he thought he was dismissing a man. What he didn't realize was that he had just provoked a movement. Ibrahim Traoré didn't shout. He didn't plead. He stood, with facts, with purpose, and with the quiet strength of someone who doesn't need permission to lead. This wasn't just a clash of opinions. It was the sound of an old order cracking. Schiff represented the echo of a world where influence was bought, not earned. Traoré brought the voice of a future where dignity can't be negotiated. In the end, this wasn't about titles, governments, or even borders. It was about who speaks when the world goes quiet. And who listens when power finally meets principle. Remember the smirk. But never forget the answer.